Ukraine's president got an invitation to join the NATO summit, but will he also get an invitation to join the alliance? Ukraine's prospects of becoming a NATO member are at the very top of the agenda as leaders gather this week in Lithuania. Many allies have already said Ukraine should join after the war is won, that is. And Ukraine's leadership has called for patience as it pushes on with its counteroffensive against the dug-in Russian front. Kyiv hasn't been able to announce any major battlefield victories since it began a month ago, but says every square kilometer is worth fighting for.
Ukraine launched its spring offensive in June after months of anticipation, but so far gains have been modest. Even President Volodymyr Zelensky has acknowledged that the counteroffensive has been slower than many had hoped.
Not everything is easy. There are certain difficulties because, first of all, our land is mined. We would like to be making bigger gains. They're smaller than what we want.
A look at Ukraine's geography helps to explain why. For months, the front line has been largely unchanged. It's thought Ukrainian forces would try to push through Russian lines in the south and east. One of the areas that has seen heavy fighting is around the southern town of Kyiv. As satellite images show, the land is mostly patchwork fields. And those fields are flat, which poses specific risks for Ukrainian forces trying to retake the land. It means having to cross open fields which have been heavily mined and which are exposed to fire from the air, as well as from Russian troops hiding behind the tree lines. And beyond those open fields, Ukrainians are encountering elaborate man-made trench defenses that the Russian forces had months to build. The defenders also had time to put up so-called dragon's teeth to stop tanks. Then there's the learning curve. Military experts say Russia has picked up from its mistakes earlier in the war and has adjusted its tactics to the conditions on the battlefield. Still, analysts say Ukraine's counteroffensive is capable of making progress, despite the unforgiving terrain. But it will take time.
Aliona Lithgow is a former Ukrainian MP and now a global affairs analyst. She joins us tonight from London. Ms. Lithgow, good to have you on the show. Now, you're not only very interested in this counteroffensive because you're Ukrainian, your own brother is fighting on the front lines. So if it's okay, I'd like to ask you how he's doing and what you're hearing from him.
Good evening, Nicole. Thank you for having me. My brother is indeed fighting in the east. At the moment, he's in the northeast of Ukraine on the Liman axis. He was moved there from the southern district around Bakhmut area where he's fought this year as well, because he was part of the liberation campaign of Kharkiv region last year. So he was the first one to go into Izium and Liman. And there were reports that Russians were building up troops on the northern axis again, so he got moved there. And indeed, hearing your report about the counteroffensive, perhaps it is now going as fast as everyone expected, including the soldiers on the front line, because they are frankly not seeing the reinvigoration of the armament and of the artillery and ammunition supply.
So would this counteroffensive have moved more quickly if the West had been quicker to supply more effective weaponry?
Absolutely. There were, of course, two impediments to the prompt and effective counteroffensive on Ukraine's side. One, we had a very wet spring, so the weather conditions would simply not allow for the heavy artillery to move through the terrain of Ukraine. But secondly, of course, that postponement of weapons supply, the constant deliberations on artillery supplies, the tanks, we've seen many conversations happening there, the long-range weapons especially, and now the fighter jets that Ukraine so desperately needs. All of those postponements gave Russia a chance to, A, build up their own troops and supplies of weapons, and B, of course, fortify. We're now seeing 3 to 4 lines of fortifications and minings of their territory up to 30 kilometers into the occupied land. So it is indeed very hard for soldiers to proceed. And because the human life is the most important asset that Ukraine has, we are not treating the soldiers as a cannon fodder, similarly like Russians do. We're trying to preserve life, and that's why the counteroffensive is moving slower than perhaps is expected.
Yeah, criticism of the slow advancement of troops doesn't go unnoticed by Ukrainian leadership, though. I want to play a short excerpt from a video released by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry and then get back to you. So there we have Ukraine's military leadership basically saying to you, this is all abstract. We're out here doing the fighting, and we know very well what we're doing. Now, you yourself live in the UK. What's the most striking difference you see between how this counteroffensive is perceived by outsiders and how Ukrainians see it?
I think it's just two different realities. It's very difficult to imagine the country at war and being able to not just be in the trenches and fight on the front line, but live in the country that is actively fighting war, having someone whose lives are at risk every day. So the reality is indeed quite different. I by no means can judge the people not understanding the full scale of it, but I think it's important for people in countries like the UK or Germany to understand that it is indeed not a Hollywood movie or a blockbuster. It takes effort, it takes dedication, and it takes great sacrifice, which are translated into human lives.
Mm-hmm. There is a lot of support and sympathy for Ukraine around the world. Are you worried at all that the use of cluster munitions could damage that political capital and see Ukraine and its biggest ally in Washington cede at least some of the moral high ground in this conflict?
The cluster munition provision by the United States to Ukraine has caused some disarray within perhaps the NATO alliance, because some countries, most of the NATO countries, have signed a Dublin Convention that bans.
And most countries in the world.
Yes, but the United States and Russia have not. And sadly, Russia has been using cluster munitions on the territory of Ukraine for a year and a half of the war now. We've seen the damage and repercussions of them using those weapons. My brother has come under fire of cluster munitions too, and they are quite vicious weapons. But there is a stark difference between how Russia is using them and how Ukraine would use them, because they were targeting civilian areas. They were targeting people with that were living in villages and towns that were not on the front line, whereas Ukrainians are now going to liberate occupied territories and fighting the immediate front line with Russians. And of course, if we're talking about the leftovers, the unexploded munitions from the cluster bombs, it is going to be Ukraine's job, and we are dedicated to that, to clear up whatever residue of weapons we have on our land, and that will include all the mines that are left behind by Russians. Because if you think about it for a second, Ukraine's mine territory is the size of the United Kingdom. It's the most heavily mined territory in the world.
Yeah. We do have to be careful using the conditional here, because Ukraine would not use cluster munition. There are already reports by Human Rights Watch, for example, that have documented extensive use on Ukrainian and on the Ukrainian side as well. But I do want to move on, because NATO leaders start their annual meeting in Vilnius tomorrow. What does Ukraine need from that summit, and what do you realistically believe is going to get?
Ukraine needs an invitation into the alliance. I think it's as simple as that. It is very reassuring to hear that the membership action plan, the long roadmap that was offered to Ukraine before, has been scrapped, similarly as it has been scrapped to Sweden and Finland last year. So that is one reassuring step. The establishment of the NATO-Ukraine Council, or the reforming of the NATO Commission to Ukraine into a council, which indicates clear membership between the alliance and Ukraine, and partnership that could effectively translate into further membership. Those steps are really reassuring, but I would like to be more optimistic about the summit, as for now it seems like Ukraine is still in the waiting room and it still needs to prove that it's not NATO expansion that threatens Russia or the world order. It is actually the ambiguity that Russia thrives on. And we've seen that with both wars in Georgia and in Ukraine after two countries were denied NATO membership in 2008. So hopefully this summit will rectify that.
That was Aliona Lithgow, Global Affairs Analyst in London. Thank you for your view and for your time.
Thank you.
Mark Hansian is a retired U.S. Marine colonel and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And earlier I asked him about his expectation of the Ukrainians' counteroffensive.
Well, I think many people had hoped that by this time in the offensive, they would have broken through the Russian defenses and got into the open spaces beyond, had a chance to use all the armor and armored vehicles that they've received from NATO and the United States. That clearly hasn't happened. Now, they are still moving forward, so they have not, in military terms, culminated. They have not run out of steam, but the hope had been that they would be further along than they are. And we've heard that from both Ukrainian officials and U.S. officials.
It was clear always that this wasn't going to be a walk in the park. Were the West's expectations maybe not realistic?
I think some of the expectations were not realistic. I heard many people speculating about trying to retake Crimea, for example, which would require getting to the coast and then jumping over a body of water that clearly out of reach at this point. For the last couple of months, before the counteroffensive, you saw officials trying to tamp down these expectations. General Milley, for example, said that it was going to be a tough fight. It was going to take some time. So it wasn't everybody, I think, who had expanded expectations, but there was a sense out there that maybe this counteroffensive would bring victory or something close to it.
Yeah, Mr. Hansian, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry has reacted to concerns that the counteroffensive is going too slowly. Let's take a quick look at a video the ministry put out on Twitter and then continue talking. Mr. Hansian, the message here to you, this is very abstract. We are out here doing the fighting for Ukraine, and we know very well what we're doing. So my question to you is, can the Ukrainian troops afford to continue their offensive the way they started it, or do they need to change their strategy maybe?
It's a little hard to say at this point. They're probing for a weakness. They just need to break through in one spot, and that's still possible. They're attacking along a number of places on the front line. So they still have some combat power in reserve. I think they're going to keep this up for some time. The video makes a couple of very important points, and of course it's very clever. This takes time, and that the Ukrainians know what they're doing. Now, one of the challenges the Ukrainians have is that the demands of this kind of an attack, of fortified complex, dug-in troops, requires a lot of skill. It requires coordinating combined arms, and not all Ukrainian units have received the kind of training that they would need to really be skillful at that. So they're really being challenged on their training.
If results continue to underwhelm, though, could that lead to Ukraine supporters growing more and more impatient?
Well, unfortunately, I think we see that now. There have been a lot of complaints about a forever war, that this war might go on for a long period of time, consuming resources and causing casualties. There's long been what you might call a peace party in both the United States and Europe that would prefer negotiations. The problem with negotiations is that there's no overlap between the two sides. Negotiations would, in effect, be an in-place ceasefire and a partial victory for Putin.
As someone who knows what combat is like, could that kind of pressure do more harm than good on the battlefield?
There are no shortcuts, and this is going to be a long war. The Ukrainians are determined to liberate all of their country. I think they're going to keep at it. If this counteroffensive is disappointing, I think that they will regroup, retrain, re-equip, and try again.
Let's look at the other side then. The Wagner mutiny, the chaos in Moscow, and Putin looking weaker than ever at this point. How have all of these things affected what happens on the battlefield?
Well, unfortunately, so far they have not affected the battlefield. They've had tremendous political importance, of course, the turmoil in Moscow and what the relationship is between Putin and Prigozhin. But on the battlefield, I don't think that there's any effect. Wagner had already pulled out of the front lines and was already in its training camps reorganizing. So there wasn't this hole that all of a sudden opened up. And as far as we can tell, the average Russian unit on the front line has not reduced its effectiveness or combat power. So unfortunately, on the front line, things continue as before.
That was retired U.S. Marine Colonel Mark Kansian. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Thanks for having me on the show.